Hi, this is Jeff Stratford from Wilkes University. This short lecture will be on the threats to tropical forests. It'll be kind of a downer, but this is part one, just the issues. And the second part will be solutions. So let's get through this, leave you a bit depressed, but then next lecture will be the great solutions we have, make you feel a little bit better. All right. By far, the most important threat to tropical forests is deforestation, just a loss of habitat. And that is due to, so why are they cutting down the forests? Agriculture, timber, and urbanization. So people need a place to live, they need to build those houses, and then you need to feed people. So getting into specifics of agriculture, palm oil is a big issue, particularly in the Southeast Asian tropics. And maybe you've seen images in the popular media of orangutans losing their habitats to palm oil plantations. Palm oil grows in lowlands. It's a smaller problem in the Americas, but it certainly is becoming more important. And the issue is, although this looks like a forest, picture was taken in Costa Rica. If you look closely, it's a monoculture, a very dense monoculture. There's not a lot of undergrowth, and this monoculture sets up a very rigid structure. And the diversity in the tropics is largely due to all those niches out there, so very diverse structure. So this very relatively simple structure of a forest means we're going to have low diversity. The other issue that's big in the tropics right now, particularly in the lowlands, is sugarcane. We see this not only in wet areas, but we see it in drier habitats as well. So if you drive around the Guanacaste region of Costa Rica, which you can see in this photo on the left, there's just huge areas that are nothing but sugarcane. And a lot of that sugarcane, of course, is grown for sugar, but much of that sugar is also used for alcohol production. And that alcohol will go towards supplementing automobile fuel. So if we look at the picture on the right, you can see that sugarcane, it's a grass, and it grows exceedingly dense. And just like palm oil, there's a relatively simple structure, and it's so dense that very few organisms can persist in sugarcane. As I'm sure there's also a few insects that inhabit these areas as well. After a forest, you will find, so if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, in the lower half of that picture, you see a big brown patch. So after you harvest, they'll often burn those sites. And I've seen many more birds using those habitats, those burned over areas. So on the Caribbean side of the American tropics, particularly in Costa Rica, you'll see lots and lots of banana and pineapple, and both of these are increasing in area. Relatively low diversity in both those habitats. And the other issue with banana and pineapple is there's heavy use of pesticides, which can spill over and affect neighboring habitats. So coffee, of course, is huge in Costa Rica and throughout the tropics. It's not found in, well, most of the coffee is not found in lowlands. You can find Robusta in some lowlands, but mid-elevation forests, so not the high montane rainforests or the lowlands, but somewhere in the middle, you'll find lots and lots of Robusta, Arabica plantations. The diversity within a coffee plantation is largely determined by how those plants are managed. And there's a range of shade that can be used. So there's full sun coffee, shown down at the bottom with no trees. And just like other monocultures, very low diversity. This has the lowest diversity of all the coffee plantation types. The highest, seen on the top, would be rustic. And that would be a low density of coffee plants with complex shade trees above, so a mid-story and canopy trees. And because you have this complex structure, you have lots of diversity, much more diversity. And what you'll find in many places in Costa Rica and elsewhere is this commercial polyculture where it's partial shade. So there are some shade trees, but most of the canopy is open. And this has, as you might expect, intermediate diversity. So highest diversity in the rustic, but there's also a few places where you actually see that. Few places actually use no shade. And that's because the coffee plants themselves can't handle the full sun. It's actually the upper leaves are almost useless, and it's the lower leaves that are shaded by the upper leaves that are the most productive. So sun coffee isn't even that productive. So lots of plantations in semi-shade, and these have some diversity. And I'll point out that in the American tropics, the semi-shade and shade coffee plantations are extremely important for migrating passerines. And these are birds that breed in North America, but spend their winters in Costa Rica or even more south into South America. And they'll stop over in the shaded coffee plantations and fill up on insects. And we do know that birds play an important role in controlling insects in these habitats. So it's good for coffee farmers to have shade. And not only does the shade provide habitats for birds, it makes for better coffee. We know that the longer the coffee bean takes, the more concentrated the flavors become and produces a better quality coffee. Okay, and then most people think that the rainforest is being cut down for timber, but usually that deforestation is just a side product. But there are places where timber extraction is still important, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia. There's lots of protected forests in the Americas, although tree poaching, which is a thing, is still an issue. That's where trees that are particularly valuable are singled out and cut down without permit. Many of the cutover areas that were logged historically are planted in tree plantations, and many of those are monocultures. And one plant that's particularly popular in these areas is eucalyptus, which is shown to the right here with that very colorful bark. That is a non-native tree, and I haven't done too much research into this, but just as a bird watcher, I've noticed that these forests are relatively low in diversity. Not too many birds use these habitats. And these tree plantations you'll find in lower and mid elevations. And of course, there's lots of miscellaneous crops that you'll find. These aren't the ones I just went over, aren't the only things you'll find. There's lots of endemic plants that are grown and other crops on a smaller scale. Of those, soybean has the largest distribution. In fact, in many areas, it's can cover large extents of what was rainforest. And those fields, of course, have low diversity, and so do things like melons is a popular plant in Costa Rica. So those crops have relatively low diversity, and you find them in lower elevations. And in some places, you'll find these small farms, which grow a diverse crops, such as chayote, shown in the left, and palm fruits to the right. And often those small farms because they are diverse in habitat, they're often planted with other trees, will have much higher diversity than large monocultures. If you are older, you probably remember there was a time when people were boycotting Burger King and McDonald's for the loss of the Amazonian rainforest. So a lot of that is past, and the beef industry is not as large as it was, although it's still a relatively large presence. Even though the beef industry is shrinking, it can have long-lasting impacts, and that's because cows, because they weigh hundreds of pounds, can cause a lot of soil compaction, and also their waste, when it enters waterways, can cause eutrophication and really degrade waterways, both with their nutrients and because they also stir up sediment. And we find cattle pastures, cattle and dairy pastures, and low and middle elevations. And just showing you on the left is a pasture in Guanacaste, and one of the more common types of cows you'll see are these Brahmas, shown on the right, that are largely adapted to this hot weather conditions in the tropics. Urbanization is a problem of relatively small extent. So if you look at the total land area being converted to urban areas, it's relatively small. However, that is what I would consider a drastic land conversion. So if we were to take rainforests and convert it into, say, partial coffee shade, that's still pretty drastic, but there's still organisms that will use that habitat, where urban habitats tend to be very, very different. The other big thing about urbanization, not only is it drastic, it's permanent. And if you look at habitats that are urbanized, I actually don't know of any site that has been covered with housing or parking lot which has been converted over to natural habitat. It's just something that doesn't happen. Vacant lots will sit empty for decades. So even though urban areas are relatively small in extent, they are rapidly growing, particularly in the tropics where the populations are rapidly growing. Within urban areas, you have exceedingly low diversity, and the exception might be small parks will have some diversity, and we find urbanization at all elevations, so mostly in the lowlands and mostly coastal areas. And even though urban parks have relatively low diversity, I also want to point out that their value may go beyond straight up biodiversity, and urban parks might be the only contact that urban people have with nature. So they are important, even though they may be relatively low diversity. So green areas, as we know, make people feel good. It's good psychologically. We know that crime rates are lower where there's more green areas. And so they're great places to have around. All right. Habitat fragmentation is where you lose habitat and you have some remaining, but those remaining pieces are cut up into small patches. And the areas around those patches is we call the matrix. So the matrix would be the thing that embeds the small habitat patches. And as shown in this image, if you remove 50% of the forest and you keep 50, the habitat on the left will contain more species than the total area on the right. So for some reason, it's not just the habitat loss, it's the isolation of the remaining patches that'll call habitat loss. So even though you may add up and have some significant amount of forest, if they're isolated patches, they'll have fewer areas than one intact forest. So the two primary reasons for habitat fragmentation in the tropics is agriculture and urbanization. So the top is agriculture, so that's an image of Guanacaste, where you have sugar plantations and some smaller melon farms, and they have chopped up that that dry seasonal forest, and there's only a few patches left you can see around. So the darkest gray is forest, and you see there's little bits of it here and there, but isolated from other patches. The image below is the southeastern quadrant of, I'll call it San Jose, but it's the larger San Jose metropolitan area. So you can see there's some really large patches of forest, and as you move towards the interior of the city, they get smaller and smaller, and that's pretty typical of how we see the fragmentation effects due to urbanization. So at the fringes, you get large fragments, and they get smaller as you move towards the interior. So, as I explained before, that habitat patches tend to have fewer species than the same area in an intact forest. So you take 10 acres and a forest will have more species than a 10-acre habitat patch. And we've determined that actually experimentally. And this image is from a site in Brazil that was created by the World Wildlife Fund and was taken over by the Smithsonian and INPA, which is the National Research Institute in Brazil. And they created some experimental patches, and I did a lot of work in these places, and we actually tested these ideas that fragments have fewer species, and that's what we found. And the question is why? Well, we do know that patches, because they're isolated and the sun can come in through the sides, they're hotter and drier. So we know that there tends to be more wind damage. So if you look at this patch, so this is in the middle of a cattle pasture. So if you look across the pasture and look at that habitat fragment on the left-hand side, you can see where it's a perfect square, and we're looking at one of the corners, and then the left edge, you can see that there's significant wind damage and the canopy is opened up, where on the right-hand side, it's a relatively intact canopy. So the majority of the winds are coming in from the left. The result of having more sun is that you get much denser vegetation, and that can be that can inhibit some species from wanting to live in those habitats. And also the drier, less humid aspects can also cut down on. So those isolation effects as well are important. So not only is there sort of these microclimatic changes, there's the isolation itself. So even if these habitats were perfect for certain species, they may not be able to get there. So if you look at organisms that cannot survive the matrix, so let's say it's dangerous, you are an urban park, we can't expect turtles or salamanders or things that crawl and walk to get to urban parks, because they'll most likely be eaten or run over by the time they get there. Some things are unwilling to cross open areas. So the bird on the right is a wing-banded antbird, and that's one of our study species. That bird, for whatever reason, would not cross open areas. So it really disliked crossing these patches, and we did not find them in any of the small fragments, only the largest fragments. And the question is, were they just living there since the time that those fragments were isolated, or did they actually have opportunities to colonize at some point? Regardless, these small patches like the one in front of you didn't have this species or many species. And then other species are more willing to cross, like hummingbirds are pretty willing to enter open areas, so they're less affected. So the effects of fragmentation are really species specific, but we can say generally speaking that fragments have fewer species. So poaching is and overharvesting are still issues in the tropics. For poaching, so we're talking about hunting animals, it's particularly important for larger mammals. So either for bushmeat or for just trophy hunting. Overharvesting, we consider that for plants. So that's the difference between the two, although the endpoint is the same, to remove an organism from its natural habitat. So like I said, some things are used for bushmeat, but many things are actually poached or are overharvested for traditional medicine. And so, for example, rhino horns are used in traditional medicine, although we know that it's just keratin, same as in your fingernails, no difference. That, black and white rhinos are hunted. Black rhinos almost to extinction. Ginseng is a plant. It may have some medicinal properties in the roots, but that is a plant. The American ginseng is extirpated, so it's actually gone from many forests where it traditionally was because of overharvesting and people a little bit too enthusiastic about using these wild resources. So not only does poaching and overharvesting affect animals and really impact some of their populations, it also introduces people to zoonotic diseases, and I just want to bring up two cases. So we know, for example, that HIV most likely jumped into the human population twice, at least 2 times, and that was likely from people working in the bushmeat trade, where a hunter poached a monkey, and then during butchering it, or at some point, blood was moved between species. For COVID-19, which we are currently experiencing, why I'm even giving this lecture online, COVID-19 came from a bat, and that bat, we largely suspect it was in an open air market where live bats may have lived. Either they were being held there for consumption, or they were living in tents. If they were there for consumption, then this is just exotic food, and the virus jumped from bats to people, and this has actually happened many, many times. Most of the times, these diseases just burn out, but every once in a while they catch fire, and COVID-19 is one of those diseases that has caught fire. So, all right, legal and illegal mining. So this is, mining is not a problem that's in large extent, like agriculture is a problem in its extent. So just the total area of agriculture is important, but with mining, it's not the extent of it. It actually takes up a small area. It's a very intense activity, and usually what happens is you clear part of a mountainside and you blast it with water to sort out your minerals. And in many places, especially with gold mining, mercury is used, and we know that waterways are heavily polluted with mercury where there's lots of illegal mining. And lastly, climate change. So, big issue, lots of media attention. Not enough, actually. So we know that there's climate change in the tropics. We know climate change is natural. What we also know is not only is it natural, but we are accelerating those changes by adding greenhouse gases, in particular CO2. There's a number of others, but the primary one is CO2. It's long lasting, and it's a greenhouse gas, and it comes from burning fossil fuels. So you can imagine all the coal that was put into the ground during the Carboniferous over 300 million years ago. We're now releasing that same carbon. So all those plants that took it out of the atmosphere, we're now putting it back 300 million years later. It's kind of mind-blowing. And we're doing it several gigatons a year. And greenhouse gases, they trap the heat and make the planet warm up a bit. Most places we know that temperatures are increasing. There's a few places where it's decreasing, and that's from a change in ocean currents. The change in temperature is most pronounced in the high latitude. So in the Arctic and Antarctic, you see it most strongly. And the temperature increases are lowest on the equator. So actually in the tropics, you see a bit less effect of climate change. When it comes to temperature, what the change you see is a change in precipitation. So there's two effects of climate change that we're seeing, temperature and precipitation. And I just want to remind you that temperature and precipitation are the primary driver of biomes. And remember, biomes are what the major plant life forms are. So grasslands, forests, desert, coniferous forests of the north, those are mostly determined by temperature and precipitation. So by messing with these things, we're going to alter what biomes grow where. And part of those biomes are what crops we can grow. So we are actually altering where crops can grow. When it comes to natural habitats, however, the changes in precipitation and the tropics are going to affect where we see things. So what's happening primarily with changes in precipitation is we're seeing much of the tropics, we're seeing dry areas get drier. And what that means is we see many areas become more fire prone. In fact, for about a year, the fires in Australia and the Amazon were a big deal. And so we're already seeing these effects, and we're going to see more of it. And although, you know, the center of lowland tropical rainforests may not be fire prone, those edges of those habitats will be prone. So what will happen is lowland tropical rainforests will be converted over to the shrublands, which is what grows back after a fire. So we'll see dry areas become drier, more fires, and then we'll also see a loss of high elevation habitats. So paramo, this vegetation that grows in the highest habitats in the tropics, which is like it's like tundra habitat, but it's tropical. And not tropical because it's so warm. It's tropical because of where it's found latitude-wise on the equator. So you'll find paramo in a very small section of Costa Rica. And if that area warms up, you'll see lower elevation vegetation encroach into that higher elevation. And paramo could be lost. And paramo has a number of endangered plants and many animals that are specific to that habitat. So I'll end by saying these are all the threats. Deforestation, climate changes are the big ones. Habitat fragmentation, also important. So these are the threats. Bit of a downer. But the next lecture we'll get into how we can mitigate these changes if we can.